Hi, my name is Martin Purnell, and welcome to Off-Grid Christianity, a weekly podcast for those who go or don't go to church and where we can meet and hear from those that have made their faith count. This podcast series is to encourage via conversation, and you can contact us as well by email, ogc@accessradio.biz. Our address again is ogc@accessradio.biz. Biz is spelled B-I-Z. Our website address, by the way, is www.offgridchristianity.co.uk. So please enjoy today's guest, who is an expert in culture and language. He once spent 9 years living in Ghana, and our guest is a talented musician in a global worship band.
Right, we're going to have to move the dog. That's Ginger. Right. Oh, my word. Right.
That was funny.
I put the dog too close doors between us and the dog, so that should be better. Yeah. I should have a red light saying on air.
Our guest is a talented musician in a global worship band, and he resides in the middle of England in a 4-generation household, plus assorted animals who all have one thing in common. They're all ginger. The animals, that is. And you might hear one of them throughout the interview. In 2020, he suffered a brain stem stroke, but he is still able to work and look after his mum, who's now in her 90s. So why is he a culture and language expert? What is his occupation? Why did he fly on his own from San Francisco as a 13-year-old? Why did he live in Ghana for 9 years? Why did he write his book, Dalek Christianity? And why does he like to think outside the proverbial box? All these questions. Have we got time to hear all the answers? Let's find out. It gives me great pleasure to welcome to Off-Grid Christianity today. And that is Tom Schwarz. Tom, thank you so much for joining us today. Whereabouts exactly in the middle of England are you, please?
It's very boring. It's a little village called Chinnor in the middle of Oxfordshire. It's only about 3 miles off the M40 when you go down the hill from High Wycombe. So it's one of these places a lot of people have heard about, but an awful lot of people haven't.
Do you have red kites flying around by any chance?
We have beautiful red kites. We also sometimes have a notice which somebody stencils on the sign, which says underneath Chinnor, it says in nice letter-set letters, "You'll never leave." And that has often been on there for months before the council actually notice and remove it because it looks so good.
You can check out any time you like, but you can never leave.
Never leave.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, Tom, let's find out more about you then. 5 maybe not so interesting questions, or maybe they are interesting. Fingers on the buzzers, no conferring. Question number 1. If you could invite anybody from history for an evening meal, alive or dead, so that you can ask them questions, who would it be?
I took a lot of time trying to think about this, and I finally settled on Mikhail Gorbachev.
Oh, really? Well, do you know what? I don't think anyone's ever chosen that answer in all the years I've been doing this. Tell me more.
Well, one of my questions is, how did he manage to rise through the Communist Party without causing a stir? And then he managed to dismantle the Soviet Union and try to bring in an era of greater freedom and openness. Now, I studied Russian at university, studied a bit of Soviet history. So I did my final year essay on the Lenin cult, which was something that Stalin tried to figure out, sort of making Lenin into some kind of messiah figure. On my university bedroom wall, I had to go to Moscow, and I brought back some posters. And one of them said, now, if you're an Anglican, you will immediately recognize this. Lenin жил, Lenin жить, Lenin будет жить, which means Lenin died, Lenin lives, Lenin will live. That doesn't half mimic the saying that Anglicans say, Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. Now, Stalin studied to be an Orthodox priest before he was thrown out.
Apparently so.
So that's why I'm very interested in Soviet history, and I chose Mikhail Gorbachev as an example of what could happen, but what's happening now, that's different.
Well, that's a great answer. If you ever get a chance, because of my time machine, to bring back Mikhail Gorbachev and interview him, because he died last year, didn't he?
He died recently, yes.
Ask him what he knows about Stalin's daughter, because that's a fascinating story in itself. So much so that she ended up living in Bristol for a few years. So I'd like to know what he knows about her and everything else like that. Great stuff. Yeah, it's also interesting about Stalin, as you intimated there. He has some sort of Christian backstory. So it'd be lovely to know, or maybe not so lovely to know, as to what actually happened, as to what made him turn around to be what he's now known for in the West.
I think he was thrown out of Orthodox Training College for running rackets on the side. So I'm not sure there was ever any transformational something happening in his life. I think it was more that with that background, he sort of theologized the Communist Party into, well, he was just sorting it out to try and, he was the general secretary and he made it all about his own power. But he wanted people to sort of worship Lenin as this messiah figure. And I remember very bittersweet. In 1980, I actually went to the Kremlin, and there's a mausoleum there where you can file past and you can see the body of Lenin. I don't think you can see it anymore. There he was. It was a very, very weird experience, one I shall never forget.
Any ideas where Mikhail stood in his faith, or if he had a faith?
I remember when they came to visit London, Raisa wanted to be photographed with a nativity set in the background, and this was remarked upon. However, I'm wondering, because he was so good at being sort of not being who he really was, because how else could you rise through the Communist Party and get to such a position of power?
Yeah.
I think it would be very, very difficult to know. I certainly feel he was a force for good in the Soviet Union, but I think it's one of those things that you could probably conjecture about, but at the end of the day, you're not going to know.
I suppose if I was doing a proper political conversation here, we'd have to get someone who would disagree with you. Please come in, Vladimir Putin. What do you think, Vlad? He's not a great Mikhail Gorbachev fan, is he?
No, and a lot of people in Russia are not, because they feel he gave too much away. That's what I wouldn't agree with that, but that's what they would say. There, I'll put in the other point of view for the people who can't be on the air.
Exactly. So we're getting a balanced view here.
Here we go.
Very BBC. Tom, this is a matter of interest then. How good is your Russian these days?
It's one of these things where I can fool somebody for a very short time, but I've always been good at mimicking.
Oh, okay.
So, for example, if you want to talk with a Russian accent, the easy way to do it is simply to take your tongue and move it towards the middle of your mouth. That was all I did.
I can't do that.
It's a very difficult language. I'm actually trying to learn Ukrainian through Duolingo at the moment, but it's sort of 80% similar to Russian, so perhaps I should get back to that. Yeah, I remember a few years ago, I met somebody in some country I probably can't tell you about, and the only language we had in common was Russian, and we tried to have a conversation, but it was quite stilted. Yeah, so who knows? I remember being asked to present a seminar in Moscow, but it wasn't sure if I would be needed. And I said, well, if you do want me, I need at least 6 months to polish up my Russian. And thankfully, that never actually happened. Someone else was able to do the seminar. So I was quite relieved, actually.
Because they often say, I think, that learning English as your second language is quite difficult. How difficult is it to learn Russian?
There are different challenges. I think the challenge of English is just so illogical and so imprecise. Whereas the Russian challenge is much more that there are a lot more grammatical stuff you have to learn. But the spelling's mostly logical. So once you learn the alphabet, you can work out how to pronounce a word.
Okay.
The Russian has things in verbs called aspects, and they have the perfective aspect and the imperfective aspect. And as soon as you think you've mastered it, then your Russian teacher tells you, no, you should have used the imperfective aspect there. And you'd say, why? And they say, oh, it's a feeling.
Oh.
I remember, I was doing French as a second subject. In my final year at university, my French translations were coming out perfect with the odd little correction every page. My Russian ones were still just covered in red ink. Those are the days. Red ink on paper. I'm showing my age here.
Yeah. Do they have genders?
Yes, they have 3 genders. Unlike a Ghanaian language I was involved in, which had 10.
What?
Yeah, because a gender isn't a gender. It's actually a noun class.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Now, in German, for example, you have masculine, feminine, and neuter. That's what they call the genders. But it's a very deceiving way of describing something, because the German word for female is a rather derogatory term, I think. It's Weib. And it's actually neuter, das Weib, which makes no sense. That's because it's not supposed to make sense. Once you've got more than 3, you can't have masculine, feminine, neuter, because those are the only 3 words that exist in that sort of area. Well, we've got multiple people who like to refer to themselves many, many genders these days. But in Mampruli, nouns were divided into 10 different classes, so that the nouns behaved in 10 different ways. And you had to learn all those 10s. That was the language of Northern Ghana. So Russian has only got 3. So that's not too bad.
Can you imagine, like 5,000 years ago, sitting around a campfire, we need to learn a new language. Now, how can we make it simple as possible? I know, let's have 10 genders, but let's not call them genders. Let's call them something else. Bizarre.
This is the amazing thing, but I love this story. When we lived in Northern Ghana, our daughter was about 4 or 5, and she would play with the local girls, obviously. And once she came up, she said, Bintu's mum has a headache and she would like some paracetamol. Interesting. I knew Bintu didn't speak any English. So I said, what did Bintu actually say to you? What words did you use? She said, Bintu's mum said, so Jenny was there for my daughter, was actually translating as she went, because she would chat in Mampruli to Bintu and then come to us and just chat the same thing in English, not even aware that she was translating.
Wow.
And that shows that when you learn a language from scratch, you hear it in the womb. It's a different part of your brain The part of our brain that we use to learn languages when we're older is much more logical and sequential, and it's harder work. But if you learn a language as a child, or several languages, that's why a lot of people do pick up several languages early on. They just know them, and then they can switch easily between them. They can code switch, they can do all sorts of things, which most of us English people, we're all brought up speaking just the one language, and we only use one language for all sorts of situations. And that is actually not what most of the world does.
Why can't I have been thrown into a French class as a 5-year-old instead of suffering at school trying to learn it?
Yeah, I know. It's hard if you don't have a motivation as well. If you're not going to live there, it's very difficult.
There is that. Well, that's a cracking answer. That's probably the longest answer we've ever had for question 1. Let's see how we get on with the others. Question 2. Who is your favourite biblical character or favourite biblical story or favourite parable, please, Tom?
Oh, it has to be the parable of the prodigal son.
Because?
I think the picture of God the Father as portrayed by the Son, the fact that he picks up his skirts and runs, which is so countercultural. People in Middle Eastern culture didn't run. If you were respectable, you would walk everywhere. Only kids would run. And so that shows the love of the Father towards us. There's so many things. There's a great book by Kenneth Bailey, sadly no longer with us, which I'd recommend to. Can't remember what it's called, but anyway, Prodigal Son by Kenneth Bailey, who brings out a lot of the Hebrew in there, even though it's in Greek, but there's Hebrew underneath. And the other one is the second son, the other brother, who we often forget.
Yes.
But he also wanted his inheritance. And he also lost his way. And a lot of us think we're going to identify with the prodigal son. But, you know, most church people, we're not going off partying and taking drugs and doing all that, are we? We do live sort of respectable lives. We still know we need to turn to God. That's where we are. We're the older brother. We need to give up the legalism, the sense of entitlement. He looked down on his other brother who had gone off to a foreign land and was obviously misbehaving. Often he's like the elephant in the room. He's not mentioned in the parable, but he's just as important. Sometimes we need to realize that we are him sometimes.
That's a very good, well-educated answer. Thank you. And of course, whenever this question comes up and the answer, the prodigal son, comes from a guest, in light of this, then, who was the most disappointed out of all to see the prodigal son return? And you would say?
Oh, the brother, probably.
No, the fatted calf.
Of course.
Yes.
You got me there,
yeah,
of course.
It's a very old joke. This could be a sign of where we're going today.
Yeah, I know a lot of old Christian jokes, but I don't actually know that one. So.
Oh, wow. Question 3. If you were Prime Minister for the day and could change any law or impose a new law, what would it be, please, Tom?
I sort of cheated a bit on this, and I said I would set up a committee to investigate something so I could do that for one day.
That's very good. That gets you out of that. Fantastic.
Yeah. So I would set up a committee to measure wealth differently, not just based on GDP.
Oh, this seems to be a current theme of late. So what would you do?
Well, that's the trouble. I've thought about this many a time, and I've looked at different parties and their policies, and I haven't had time to look at, I think there are other countries such as Nepal that have a happiness index, but I haven't spent time analyzing how they do that and whether there's also spin, you know, and the government says, oh, it's all right, our people are very poor, but they're very, very happy, so move on, nothing to see here. So I think there's always a danger in that. But if you look at the way Jesus measures wealth, the way God measures wealth, we know it's not financial. We know that great wealth is knowing him and is knowing the benefits of the gospel. But how do we measure that? Deep down, we all know that money doesn't bring happiness, but a lot of people still chase after it. I mean, I'm interested in, say, the Green Party. They're looking at, you can't just have growth on growth, but I don't think that even they have yet found a model that adequately will measure this. That's why I suggested it, because it's a whole new area that I think the world is moving very fast, and things we value need to be counted differently.
Well, it's interesting that you say that as an answer, because I told you off air about, and I normally do one podcast a week, the 3 podcasts I did last week. It turns out there is just an incredible trilogy that I believe everybody has to hear about how and what Jesus wants us to do in the community, from 3 different people who didn't know each other at all. One lives in California. It's an incredible trilogy, as it will be called from now on in. One of those guests, Dave Mann, chose the same answer. And his wife, being a sociologist at university, is very heavily involved in looking at how to do it in other countries, and chose Sweden as like, this is a model that we could actually work on. So if you want to know more about how to do it, check out Dave Mann's podcast from about 2 weeks ago.
Right, will do.
Thank you for that. Question 4. Outside of family events, Tom, what has been your most enjoyable day out, please?
So I'm part of this intercultural worship band, the Resonance Band. Yeah, look out for them. Heaven on Earth in Coventry Cathedral coming up. Anyway, but it's hard to pick just one of our events, but I do remember we had Party in the Park in Aylesbury just before COVID. That was on a huge stage, and I remember we had so much fun just presenting songs from all over the world to different people. We even had somebody who was listening to us doing Nutndode, which is a Jamaican patois song, and that's the language he spoke, and he actually came out of his flat and joined the party because he couldn't believe that we were doing proper Jamaican reggae.
Wow.
Now, I would also like to have a day out on a roller coaster, but I've got too many slip discs in my neck, so I'm afraid I can't risk it. So we took my family to Disneyland recently. At least my daughter did. There were lots of nice rides to go on that were not roller coasters, so that was good, but I had to stay off those.
I took my then fiance on a roller coaster. Yeah.
Ooh, good move?
No. No.
Right. I shall say no more.
She still became my wife, but no.
But no.
Question 5. What has been your most embarrassing moment, please, Tom?
I'll share one just because I've got to. When I was young, I was probably about 13, and I had terrible stage fright.
Oh, wow.
I completely froze when I was supposed to be interviewing another boy who was playing the manager of a football team. So I had 7 questions to ask, and the only question I could remember was, how are the reserves doing? Which was the one question we decided not to ask. And so I just stood there on stage, just absolutely frozen to the spot. And then one of the other lads, I should bless him for this, he was sort of sat behind a table pretending to be the sound guy. He said, we appear to have lost the sound, which I thought was a brilliant ad lib. And I shuffled off stage and, oh dear. Yeah.
And how many people spotted that was actually not part of the sketch?
Well, actually, it was just all we were doing. We were performing it for the year below at school. So there would have been about 80 boys in there. It was a boys' school. This was the 70s. I think often nobody said anything. Yeah, there was a lot of that. There was a lot of nobody said anything's going on. I wasn't ridiculed, but then nobody laughed at me for it. But then nobody said anything about anything, really.
See, in TV land in the 70s, one of the greatest put-downs I heard on TV was done by Max Boyce in Wales.
Yes, I remember the name, yeah.
Someone was heckling him. He says, I've seen you on TV. And the person said, oh, yeah? He said, yeah, it's called interference. And I thought that was really good. But you can't explain it now because everyone has really good plasmas.
Yes.
OLEDs.
It doesn't work anymore, does it? Yeah.
It doesn't work. That was the 1970s, by the way, not the 1870s. I have to say that's a cracking answer for an embarrassing answer. And well done to your mate.
Yeah. His name was Richard Hoyle. We used to call him Oily Hoyle from Merry Wigan. So if Richard Hoyle, if you're listening, hello.
I wonder whatever happened to Richard. Let us know, please.
I've only been in contact with about 1 or 2 friends from school. One was called Chris Harbour, and we used to play in a punk band. We never got beyond the garage. He was posting stuff on Facebook, and I thought, you eat out at lots of fancy places, mate, don't you? And then I realised, no, it was his own food. And then I found out he reached the quarterfinal of MasterChef a few years ago.
Talking of food, obviously be used for culture.
Absolutely, yes.
You are a culture and language expert. My definition of an expert is somebody who lives at least 50 miles away and carries a briefcase. What is a culture and language expert, please, Tom?
You know what? You've put me on the spot. I'm going to have to talk about it without revealing what organisation I work with.
That's fine.
Yeah, we do actually have a course which helps you to acquire cultural skills. I think it's sad that we're not all cultural experts, actually, because it helps us to open our eyes. Because I think the first thing is open your eyes, open your ears, and I guess, as we're talking about food, open your taste buds.
Yeah.
But think about why. I remember when I was at Bible college, there was a Japanese girl, and she was very nice. And about halfway through the term, she realized she wasn't making any friends.
All right.
The reason why, when people said, would you like to come for a cup of tea? She didn't like tea, so she didn't come. So she didn't recognize it wasn't about drinking tea together.
Yeah, of course.
That means let's spend at least 15 minutes because that's how long it takes to drink a cup of tea so we can get to know each other and have a chat.
Yeah.
She didn't have the cultural eyes to see that. Now, for us, it was obvious. We know what can you have a cup of tea because we were brought up in it. It's like trying to ask a goldfish what water is. Well, we live in it. It's just a process of opening your eyes. And then once you've done that, you can enjoy the journey and you can sometimes ask questions as long as you know who are the right people to ask the questions to, or be willing just to ask why. And the other thing is, I think to get out of a feeling that this is the right way. I remember there's a part where Jesus heals a blind man and it says, Jesus spat on the ground and made some mud out of the spittle And all the mothers are going, Johnny, no, you don't need to. When you say you want to follow Jesus, that doesn't mean you should do that. So spitting on the ground in British culture is unhygienic, and it's not seen as something that's very acceptable.
Unless you're a professional footballer, of course, which really annoys me.
Yes, got to, don't they? You think they need to keep the fluid level up while they're running around there for 90 minutes, wouldn't you?
I think so.
But is that a cultural thing? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I used to watch a lot of football, and now I've stopped. That's another story. So now I've just got me thinking, why do footballers spit? Again, we're making a judgment on them.
Yeah.
There may be something in football culture. It's a sign of superiority or a sign of success or something. I don't know.
I think it's because David Beckham did it. And then you've asked David Beckham. He said, yes, well, Martin Peters did it. And then you've asked Martin Peters, yeah, well, Jimmy Greaves did it. And then you go all the way back to Fatty Wedlock, who played for Bristol City in 1906. One of the last players to ever play for England with a Bristol City shirt. So it could just go back and back and back, can it?
You find out those things.
Yeah.
It's the classic story of the knuckle chopped off the ham bone.
Yes. For those who don't, please tell it. It's very good.
Okay, this is a classic story, and I'm very sorry if you've already heard it.
Joyce Meyer, I heard it from. Not personally.
I think I heard it from David Pitchers, but anyway. The young lady is off to her mother's for a meal. She notices that the knuckle of the ham bone has been cut off before cooking it. And she says, "That's interesting, Mum. Why do you do that?" "I don't know. I'll ask my mum." So she asked Granny, and Granny's like, "Oh, I don't know. My mother did that." Now, great-grandma was still alive and in a home, so they asked her, so "Why did you cut the knuckle off the ham bone before you cooked it?" "Well, when I was little, the pot was very small and it wouldn't fit." It's classic. And this is often why we do things. So one of the things in my book is often when you think, oh, I don't like what that person's doing, just ask yourself, why don't you like it? Is it something about your background that is just different from their background? And that is the first step. Then you enjoy the journey as you learn more and more about what people appreciate and what things mean. But you don't know where that journey is going to take you, but you need to start it.
Well, what another great link in then. Did you write a book, he says knowingly? Was it called Dalek Christianity? If so, tell us more.
Well, yeah, I wanted to write a book which had a title more like an essay, which was sort of musings on Jesus' prayer for unity and what it means to us today. But I realized that nobody except about 3 academics was going to buy a book like that. And also, I didn't have time to write a book several hundred pages long. So you'd be glad to know this is like about 65 pages long. And then I suddenly came up with Dalek Christianity. Obviously, Daleks, we know. I hope you know anyway. A few of my American friends are like, what is Dalek? It's a bit niche in the States. Anyway, so Daleks obviously wanted to destroy everything that wasn't exactly the same as themselves. That's my premise, which is a little extreme, but it's always good to knock down a straw man, isn't it? And so I started with that. And then I looked at various themes, things that perhaps could stop us from actually being the feet on the prayer of Jesus. Because most of the time, we're the ones who pray to Jesus. Jesus tells us how to pray. God tells us how to pray. But there's very few places where Jesus prays for us. You got him praying for Peter, but in John 17, he very clearly prays for not only his disciples, but for all those who will come after. And that is you, that is me, that is everyone listening to this. So Jesus is praying right now for us to be one, to be unified. I just explored this because I realized it can't mean in all places at all times throughout church history, we all act, think, and feel the same way, because there's a huge diversity in the church and in God's creation. And so as I wrote the book, I just sort of picked on various themes. And then I realized this needs to be something not just to read, but something to talk about. Each little chapter's got sort of questions for discussion afterwards. And not only that, it's actually got some cheat answers. So, you've been in a Bible study and you read the Bible, and then the guy or girl leading it says a few things, and then it says, "Now, what do you think? How does the Holy Spirit work in your life as described in this book?" And you go, "Oh, I don't know. I think what he thinks." I don't know about you. I often find some of these questions, some of these theoretical questions, they seem theoretical to me. These questions that they ask in Bible study groups or at the end of books, I struggle to sort of, apart from regurgitating what's just been said in the chapter, I don't quite sure what it means to me. So hopefully these questions are quite open. After the questions, there's actually a sort of, I don't want to call it a model answer, but there's a suggested answer. So when you get that awkward pause, then the person leading can actually come up with something.
Something you just said there, I was dying to say, this is another Hammond, the knuckle bone scenario. When you said giving a scenario and the bloke said, "Well, I don't know, whatever he was thinking." But actually, depending which denomination you went to or go to, that often would be handed down to you that you have to accept the answer. As if there's sometimes not a place when you go to a Bible study. It's not a place whereby you can actually query a question because they'll immediately assume that you're being antagonistic or negative. So perhaps that's another reason for writing this book, to get people to think outside the proverbial box. What do you think?
It's funny. One of the chapters I wrote is the skills of being a good listener, which is a bit of a joke chapter because my wife always tells me I'm one of the worst listeners around. But I knew how important it was. So you have to write a chapter on listening. One of the assumptions you can often make if somebody asks why, or if somebody asks a question, are they disagreeing with you, or are they simply wanting to explore? I haven't put this in the book because let me explain it.
Go for it.
God is infinite, right?
Mm-hmm.
If God is God, he has to be infinite. If he's not infinite, he's not God.
Mm-hmm.
We are finites because we know that. We cannot perceive everything. What I sort of come up with is that basically we are all heretics. Now, heretic is a powerful word that can use very negative. But what I really mean by that is we are all limited and bordered in our understanding of who God is and how to live as a Christian. Nevertheless, in whatever time and part of history we live in, God is leading us by his Holy Spirit, and we can live as Christians in that time. It might look different from medieval Christians or from African Christians, but we can live as Christians in that time. Having said that, because I'm a heretic, this idea itself is heretical.
Okay.
If you want to criticize me for it, then you can, because I myself, even by writing a book, it's not saying, here, guys, I wrote a book. I know about stuff that you don't know. So it's just inviting us on that journey, really. And it's putting in a few pointers, telling a few stories. Hopefully you've got your stories that you can tell as well. And once you hear my stories and stories of my friends that have allowed me to put them in the book, then you can go, oh, I had that as well. I mean, there's an obvious one. My mind is constantly assailed by negative thoughts.
Okay.
There's a verse in scripture that says we demolish every argument. We take our thoughts captive.
Yes.
Okay. Now that's been an extremely relevant verse to me because I realize these thoughts are not me. They're coming from the evil one, and I don't have to take ownership of them. Sometimes they're subtle, and sometimes they're crazy. Like, wouldn't it be fun to drive into the other car on the other side of the road? We know that's absolute nonsense. But I've seen some people, and they're like, oh, is that what your mind does? I'm saying, yeah, I'm sorry, it is. That's my struggle. Other people will have different struggles. And I think once you open it up and realize that people's journeys towards Christ are different and they have different struggles, then it's actually quite liberating. Especially want to share your testimony. You might say, oh, well, God saved me from a time when I was suicidal. And people say, well, I've never felt suicidal, Or for me, it was, I looked at all these people making these plans and doing stuff and having jobs and having families and then dying. And I thought, well, what's the point of it all? God, give me a reason why we're doing this. I had no problems. I mean, I may have been drinking a little bit too much, as a lot of students do, but, there were no obvious problems, but I wanted to know. And that's where God met me. But other people are Christians and still, they don't think of it that way. They think of it, oh, God provided for me, or God gave me peace of mind, or saved me from depression, or whatever it was. So although it was sort of depressing not to know what the meaning of life was, it didn't cause me any sort of depression, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
It's a different thing, whereas other people were struggling day to day. I mean, God's got your back. Whatever your struggle is real, and God understands it. And I believe he will meet you where it is. But sometimes our testimony might speak to someone who's going through something similar, but might not speak as powerfully to someone who's got slightly different issues. But at the end of the day, it's Jesus who is the center of our faith.
You seem to have a pretty good handle on the definition of a Christian. You seem to have a pretty good handle on the English language. You've mentioned that you can speak at least one other language. I suppose Ghanaian would be another one as well that you talked about. So what actually can you tell us about your job, please?
Oh, right. Okay. I'm going to be quite open about my job, but I won't tell you what organization I'm with.
That's fair comment.
Yeah. So that's quite good. So one of the things is that a lot of agencies are translating scriptures into minority languages of the world. Okay. I'll give you 2 seconds to think. How many languages are there in the world, Martin?
Quite a lot. 671.
You're out by a factor of 10.
Okay. 71.
Over 7,000.
Wow.
Yeah. And it's interesting, you mentioned Ghanaian as a language. Ghana actually has about 60 languages.
Wow.
Yeah. When I was was spoken by 150,000 people. So not small, but not huge either. This is your heart language. This is the challenge for a lot of the minorities in the world. It's very little comparison in the British Isles. But if you, let's say, were brought up in a Welsh-speaking village with not much English and you only had an English Bible, you would struggle. Less and less cases of that now. And in a sense, globalization might be doing our job for us as more and more people speak global languages, but there's still a significant numbers of people, multi-millions, who don't really have access. But my job, it's all very well having good scholars and local people do translation, check it, and make sure it's all good. But who's going to know about it? How's it going to change people's lives unless they're actually interacting with it? Would they prefer to listen to it rather than read it? What color is the cover of the book? Is it an acceptable color? Yeah, you didn't even think about that, did you? You know, we like black Bibles with gold letters on. They seem very sort of holy and official.
I got told off once about that.
Oh, tell me more.
Very quickly, then we'll come back to the story because it's fascinating.
Yeah.
So I was in a very well-known Christian bookshop in Bristol, just become a Christian. And the assistant knew me quite well because we went to the same church at one stage. And I went to say, I've come to buy myself a Bible. And he said, well, we've got two kinds you can have if you want the NIV. He said, you've got a red one and you've got a blue one. Which one would you like? So I said, I'll have to have a red one, definitely. And there was a lady there listening. She said, why are you having the red one? I said, because I'm a Bristol City fan. I can't have a blue one because it's Bristol Rovers colours. And she became very, very indignant and very, very annoyed with me. It was called humour.
Oh, bless her. Yeah, of course it was. Yeah, and some people don't have it.
Meanwhile, back in reality.
Yeah, meanwhile. So, for example, if you want Muslims to read a Bible, it doesn't need to be a cheap, sloppy thing. It needs to be a beautiful tome.
Wow.
It needs to have lovely binding. It needs to have gold all over it. If you've got any footnotes or any extra bits, it needs to be very, very clear which are the footnotes and which is the actual Holy Scripture, which you put a box around. Little things like that is, sometimes there are barriers to interacting with Scripture. And so my job is trying to help projects to break down those barriers and see what they're doing. Who are the people that you can reach? How can you reach them? I can tell you this story. I can't tell you what part of the world it's in. Oh, I know, but I can't tell you.
It was Antarctica. There you go.
It was the penguins. We're trying to reach the penguins. They're suffering with all those tariffs.
You see, you are not the first person to mention this. I'm trying to stick up for the penguins here.
Yeah.
It's not just a black and white issue. Carry on.
Oh, no. Anyway, in order to check the translation, they had sort of like focus groups of women and men, mostly a lot of women. And they were doing comprehension testing. Some of the people were asking more sort of open questions, is what is God saying to you through this? But what they did is the people were paid to do the comprehension testing, but they stopped the clock when they started to ask them the more personal questions. And as a consultant, I found out about this. I said, do not stop the clock. Those personal questions are the reason why you're doing the translation program. Continue to pay them for that, and you will see God do things because that's what you want to see happening. And if you stop translating and you no longer have these focus groups, that won't happen anymore. So we also need to build in how are you going to continue those focus groups when you've actually stopped translating. So that's the kind of thing I do.
What was their reason for stopping the clock?
It's because if you're an organization that's devoted to translation, you think other people will do the outreach. It's just history of organizations and organizational change and that sort of thing.
All those sorts of things. Quite rightly, you're not going to mention who you work for this mission to Antarctica and the penguins. But for those that are going like myself, really, I'm just being honest here, just explain why you can't say that you're working for Penguins United.
Penguins United. Yes, I would love to be able to be open about it. And it's not that I'm in danger, but as you know, Christians all over the world are persecuted in different ways. And some Christians are giving up their time either for nothing or very low wages, and they're translating into their own heart languages. And that is something that often the authorities don't like. And you could end up ostracized by your family. You could end up in prison. You could possibly end up dead. I know some people have been martyred. So we do this out of respect to them. Yeah, that's basically it. We're sad that we have to do this. I would love to say who I work for. We can be open about some of the countries we work in, most of the countries in Africa or South America or some Asian countries. But I remember, this is a statistic. I was about 20 years ago. There was somebody really pushing the statistic. Did you know that 95% of missionaries are going to this part and only 5% of missionaries go to the Muslim world? The trouble was, there were more than 5%, but obviously they didn't appear on the statistics of the various mission agencies that they looked at. Sometimes things are hidden and you've got to just trust God that things are going on well, but for safety's sake, we can't. And the trouble is, you've got your mission magazines and your mission websites. They want to tell all these good news stories, and it's very difficult to do so.
Thank you. I'll stop you there before
Thank you.
You feel, you're saying too much on that particular theme. But it makes total sense. Yeah. Wisdom has broken out early already on this podcast. Thank you.
Good.
Moving on slightly then, what is your background in Christianity?
This has all come full circle. So my father was born in 1930 in Berlin.
Oh, really?
He was German. My grandmother was actually Scottish, and she moved to Germany during the times of the Weimar Republic, and nobody thought anything odd about it. This was before the rise of Hitler.
Yeah.
So she took on a German passport, I think. I don't know. And then, of course, war broke out. That family were stuck in Berlin. They survived. And at the end of the war, a Lancaster bomber took my Scottish grandmother, my father, and my aunt over to England in 1946, where my dad... Seems a long story about me, but it's important to look at the background here.
This rings a bell. I don't know why, but it does. Keep going. It's fascinating.
My dad was forced to be a member of the Hitler Youth in 1944, and then he came over in 1946. He then managed to study German at Cambridge, which I always thought was a bit of a cheat, because didn't he already do German? But obviously there's a lot of literature and stuff you have to study, but anyway. And then he had to do his national service, and he became a second lieutenant in the British Army in 1951, having been in the Hitler Youth in 1944. Now, this is a great story, but the trouble was, he was traumatized by this. He did write his memoirs at some time, but very little in there. We were a very right-living family.
Yeah.
We knew what was right and wrong, but we didn't talk about God. We didn't talk about his past. I knew he would hum Lutheran hymns under his breath sometimes, but I was sort of feeling it was empty. Why were we, again, that question, why are we doing this? I remember I was a very precocious boy. I used to lie on the sofa and read the Times at the age of sort of 13.
It's when you did a crossword that I'd have been really worried about.
Oh, no, I couldn't do the crossword. And I remember there was discussions between the Roman Catholic and the Anglican Church at that time. And I thought, if these people believe in Jesus, why can't they just get on? I wasn't sure if I believed in Jesus at the time. I was just sort of, if this, then that. And I was very logical about it. What's the big deal? I knew something about Jesus, having been to Sunday school, but a lot. But through reading sort of the French existentialists and things, I became much more sort of, life is just what you make it, very much. But it's an empty way of life. It is very, very empty feeling. I went to university and I was taking a year out. That's another story. But I was a year older than the other students, had a room on my own. I heard somebody playing the guitar. Of course, it was a Christian playing guitar, wasn't it? And I ran into the late, great Mike Rimmer. Those of you who listen to Christian radio will know he's been a DJ on UCB, but I knew him before he was famous. Initially, Mike Rimmer was a charismatic, and this other guy, John Wigfield, hi John, was not more reformed. But I both looked at it, I thought, they've got something. Whatever it is, I had a hunger for it. So I thought, I need to get to know these guys. They tried to answer my questions. I don't know if they did very well or not. I don't know. They took me up to Ilkley College, because I was at Leeds Uni, where there's a lot of Christians there, and I just hung out with them. They're all right, these people. I mean, I hadn't met Christians before. I thought, interesting. Mike were playing me a lot of Christian records, so Larry Norman was a big thing then. Why Should the Devil Have All the Good Music?
Yeah.
Bryn Howarth, Randy Stonehill, Michael O. Martian, all those great. So great. It was a great era for Christian music. Maybe it was before it was all taken over by worship music. But anyway, that's another,
I know. Yes.
You know what I mean? But they did life with me. They spent time with me. They were willing to answer questions and take time. That was the main thing. And then one day Mike said, Tom, you need Jesus. I said, yeah. They thought it would take me a year. So he said, right, here's a booklet. Here's a Bible. Sort yourself out.
And that was it.
The booklet was a little booklet called Journey into Life.
Hey, Norman Warren.
Norman Warren. Yeah. That sent me on the path. And I knew that was the path. There was peace for the first time.
Wow.
And I've had my ups and downs, because that was November the 7th, 1979. Interestingly, the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, and I was a Russian student at the time, and I thought that was one in the eye for the Bolsheviks.
Peace. You just said peace. Before we do, just to backtrack, because I am fascinated by all things Second World War, and I can't understand whether it's your story that I might have read years ago in a newspaper, but I definitely remember reading a story about a Scottish lady who's living in Berlin during the Second World War and all the shenanigans involved. Was that your mum?
I don't think it was. That would have been my grandmother, but I don't think it ever made the newspapers.
What does she remember of that time?
Well, again, she died when I was only 11, so I have not had time. She was in her 70s. She had bad hips. So I do remember her, because we used to go and have holidays over in Germany, but I don't remember her sitting down. And again, a lot of people are very traumatized by this. In the 1980s and 1990s, there were a lot of ministries in Germany ministering to traumatized ex-Nazis and ex-people who perhaps realized what was going on and sat back and did nothing. Now, obviously, there must be a great sense of shame of missing something. And a lot of these people had to have help finding forgiveness for what they'd done or for what they'd not done during those times. And that was shortly after those things happened. So I don't know what my grandmother would have experienced in that case. I think this story could possibly have been repeated a few times. So there could be other people who've had similar experiences.
Wow. When you look back on your life to date, then you can see if your dad was obviously raised in Germany, granddad definitely German, grandmother Scottish, you seem to have a penchant for languages, and now God is using the skills that you've got to take it further. What else have you learnt about yourself on this journey so far? Let's
finish this story, because I think it shows me more about myself. So when I became a Christian, it was I wouldn't say it was selfish. Of course it was selfish. I wanted to have eternal life and I wanted to have peace. But when I was a young Christian, I wasn't interested in church history, and I didn't really communicate well with my parents about my newfound faith. They found it all a little bit awkward. But now I'm talking with my mum. She's 93. She's here in the house with us. She's got a little bit of memory loss, but we can still talk about these things. Now, one of the things that confused me when I became a Christian, it was all this, I was once in darkness, now my eyes can see. And I used to do all these evil things. And I used to think, yeah, but my family didn't do many evil things. I mean, at my father's funeral, it was just incredible, the sort of all the good he had done, the tributes to him, this was in 2016 or 17, was absolutely amazing. He was a school headmaster. He ran the Twinning Association, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There was a sort of disconnect coming in there. And I think there was a lot of some Christians who wanting everybody to have the same salvation story. And I was happy to go along with that because I'd found faith and it was great. But I think as the years went by, I've realized that there's a bit more to it than that.
With your background to date, what have you learnt so far about your faith, and how much of it has been challenged? Hence why, we call this off-grid Christianity.
Yeah, it has been challenging. I tell you, actually, one of the things is my attitude towards gay people. It's quite funny because I'm not sexually attracted to the same sex. But on the other hand, what do I like? I like musical theatre. I like a lot of things that are supposed to be what gay men like. And I'm like, well, I'm not. And then I think, this is another thing about culture. Cultures choose their list of favourite sins. They choose their list of acceptable sins and the list of unacceptable sins. And as evangelical Christians, we are just as guilty of that as liberal Christians or African Christians who maybe, they're only just, one generation away from heathenism. And then you suddenly realize, well, yeah, but. Actually, it goes back to that Journey into Life booklet. It said, all of us have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. It doesn't matter if you score 99 or if you score 10. You're not there. You need God's forgiveness for whatever. And I thought, and that was actually really good for me because I thought, well, I've lived a good life, but somehow there's something missing. And yeah, of course, if you don't have God in your life, that's the most important thing. My attitudes have definitely changed about that.
How often has it been for you where, say, you were in Ghana for 9 years, where you were struggling and thinking, well, God, are you actually there? What do you remember those times?
We lived in a building that used to belong to the TB officer. They no longer have a problem with TB in that town, but that house was set a couple hundred yards away from the other houses, so it's a bit isolated. We found out that it was very near the snake shrine, and we think, and that's why people avoided it. They didn't want to live in this house because it was too close to the snake shrine. They believed it to be cursed. Now, we always felt quite heavy there, even though we felt God had called us to be there. It was a heavy place, and I often felt very low. One time, the chief of Gambaga died. He was 90-something. He had been chief for 70 years. There was a contest for the chieftaincy, and this wasn't done by election. This was done by spirit fighting.
Whatever that is.
Well, basically, the contestants, the candidates for chieftaincy, would attack each other in the spirit realm. Okay. Now, if you're a Ghanaian, they would be saying, oh, yeah, that's bad, isn't it? They know about it, and they know it was evil. They would not question it. I know all sorts of things are going through your mind right now. Mm-hmm. But the fallout of that, the level of depression that I felt during that time was extremely oppressive. Mm-hmm. In fact, in 1993, we went back home for what we call furlough, which you all know. Now, since COVID, everybody knows what furlough is. Mm-hmm. And I was very low. And in fact, the organization I'm serving with said, you are too depressed to return to the field. We cannot clear you unless we see a breakthrough of some sort. I don't know how it happened. My kids were quite small. And one evening, as I was putting them into bed, I said, you know, Daddy's been a bit sad lately and sometimes gets angry. Can we pray that Jesus would make it better? My eldest daughter would have been 6, and she prayed. And even my middle daughter, who had only been 4, mumbled something. And then something happened to me, like being born again in reverse. And when I was born again, there was a real sense of peace that enveloped me. It was very real. I know it doesn't happen that way for everybody, but it was like a heaviness suddenly lifted off me. And I started playing practical jokes on the family. In fact, my wife didn't know what had happened to me. She said, what was going on? Wherever it was, I'm delivered from it. Basically, within weeks, I was cleared to return to the field. And yeah, we had our ups and downs, but basically it was good. Many years later, I was putting together a photo album. You remember photo albums? And I came across this picture of a man I'd taken a photo of. He was covered head to foot with idols and fetishes and charms and things. I mean, it was an incredible picture. And he'd come all the way from Burkina Faso to sacrifice to his ancestors who were from this town. And I took a picture of him and he asked for money. And I gave him a small amount of money. And I realized at that point, maybe some kind of spiritual bond had happened between me and him. Don't know. And so I felt that I should destroy the picture. I don't often do things like that. And we were encouraged by our organization to understand the culture and anthropology of the area. So, you can get your hands burned. I'm going to digress slightly. But I remember I was serving in another area of Ghana with a team of young people. We sent out a questionnaire from headquarters. And one of the questions was, what percentage of Christians do you think are affected by ancestral religion, occult or spirit worship, or that sort of thing? I put 100 because, and this is why, we encouraged our team not to drink the local palm wine, not because it was alcoholic, but because it has often been prayed over by the local people who were, very much beholden to the spirits of the area. They went round to someone's house and the gourd of palm wine was being passed around and they thought it would be good manners to drink some of it as they went. What they didn't realize, because we didn't have quite enough language skill at that point, was the general curse had been put on the palm wine so that anybody who wanted to curse someone could do so by drinking from it. The trouble is, at that point, one team member was angry with another team member. And anger and cursing are very close. And so as they drank, that anger turned into cursing, and it was like all hell broke loose on the team. I won't go into details, but we found a very, very early copy of Bondage Breaker by Neil Anderson, and that had some prayers in it to bind the enemy. So I said, I don't know what's going on. I'm not going to blame anybody, but we're going to pray the prayers in this book, and then we're going to break bread together, and we'll see what God does. And that's what we did, and healing was brought to the team. I'm still really good friends with the guy who got angry, so that's good, 20, 30 years later. So you're probably listening to this thing, this is crazy, but it happened. Do I know it was real? Yeah, it was so real at the time. Have I been living in Britain now for 20 odd years and do these things happen here in Britain? Not so much, but they still do. Again, that's your culture, that's your worldview, that's what you might get into. But you don't have to worry because God protects you, even in the craziest situations that you've been in. And He is over all those things.
Yes, spiritual warfare is something that we dismiss quite often as a Christian living in a fairly safe country that is the UK. And yet it exists. The fact of your job, and I'll just do it as a joke, administering to all those penguins, you have to take into consideration their background as well, so that they can understand when you come to translate the Bible that actually is relevant for them. And I'm so aware of the time and that we're rapidly running out, unfortunately, of time because we can carry on this. But if I nailed you down on this and said, everything that you've learned in the past 30 years, living away from the UK, doing what you felt God wanted you to do, knowing that God wanted you to do, to help out by translating the Bible, but looking into other perspectives, like you said, to make it as relevant as possible. Out of all these things, what could you share to encourage those that are listening today about the fact they might be holding on by the skin of their nails to God at the moment, or because they just can't be bothered to go to church, or maybe they are going to church, but they're just, whatever. What could you share?
Oh my goodness, you put me on the spot here. I'm going to say that do not disqualify yourself, because one of the things that I think we like to do is think that whatever we're going through, we're the only ones, or whatever we're going through, God cannot understand or cannot forgive us for it. But God has been there He sympathizes with our weakness, and there's always hope. See, at the end of the day, God didn't promise that we would be happy. He promised that we would be blessed. And I think when you look at the biggest perspective is that, yes, God often breaks through in the circumstances of our lives, but there are times when he doesn't. I'm not into prosperity theology. I'm into generosity theology, that God is good, but sometimes there's a bigger picture that we don't see. But the bigger picture is unseen by us, and that's where faith comes in. One of my favorite Bible passages, 1 Corinthians 15, where it talks about the resurrection body. You look at your own body now and you think, I don't know what state it's in. Mine is pretty much fallen to bits, but God looks at that and says, that is the seed compared to the plant that you're going to be. But for that seed to get into a plant, first it has to die. First it has to cross that boundary into the kingdom of God. I know for me, it was a theoretical thing when I was 18. Yeah, one day I will. What's going to happen then? But as my history teacher said, there's only two things. I'm sure he's not the only person. There's two things that are definitely going to happen to you in this world. You're going to get taxed and you're going to die. And it's not offensive to say that because it's absolutely true. There's no one who is permanently raised from the dead except Jesus Christ himself, because he's the resurrection and the life. And you can just hold on to that. And I'm not saying it will make you happy. And I'm not saying it will fix all your problems, but I am saying it will give you hope.
And the fact that you're still here to do what you're doing with everything that you've been through, it begs the question, when you're going to write down your autobiography so that we can read from it and learn from it?
I already wrote it, but quite a long time ago, so it doesn't go all the way through, and it's already quite dated. So I don't know if I want to do it again.
No, you can update it though.
Yeah, I know. Yes, so there's about a 300-page book, which was done fairly close to the actual times it happened, and it's called Breathless in Boreani, but all the names and people have been changed. So I could actually publish it. But at the same time, I looked through it recently, a year or two ago, and I thought, oh no, there's some great bits. And there's some other bits that are actually culturally so out there that maybe some people won't want to read anymore. I don't know, but it's also all the naughty things that happened that wouldn't get published in the standard books as well. I say naughty, they weren't naughty, but things that happened to you that are funny at the time.
Yeah.
Yes, it's there, but will I have time? Will I have capacity? Is it what I'm supposed to be doing? Actually, somebody had a word for me at church the week before last, and not going into details, but it did tell me that I needed to, in order to have a greater influence, greater effect, I did need to focus. And perhaps she said, you got your fingers in a lot of pies. And I'm like, yeah, I have. So maybe this might be a pie I have to take my finger out of.
Well, only one thing to do about it, pray about it and see what comes back.
Yeah, absolutely.
He says in a very, 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 you don't say Sherlock.
Yeah.
Well, it's been fantastic. I need to ask the final question, which is, who is your Christian hero? But before we do, it's only fair for people to know a bit more about Christianity, as in Dalek Christianity. How can they get hold of it, sir? Please tell us more.
Just Google Dalek Christianity, or other search engines are available, and it will pop up. So you can get it on Eden, you get it on Amazon if you must. So it's just there. And please consider using it as, I think, I'm not biased, but I think it would make an ideal Churches Together in Lent resource. So do consider it for that.
I've read it and it's very, very good. So there you go, as endorsed by me.
Thank you.
Hence why I want to know why you had to fly on your own as a 13-year-old from San Francisco. What was that about?
Oh, yeah. Well, my aunts and uncles still live in California, and we went over to visit them, and my parents came back after 3 weeks because they had to get ready to teach the school term. And they let me stay for 2 weeks longer, and they figured I'd be okay to come back on my own. I remember waiting for a couple of hours at JFK in the business lounge because I was an unaccompanied minor, chatting to some businessmen from Blackpool. And after we chatted for two hours, they said, which part of the States are you from then, lad? I said, I'm from Bury. They said, well, you better change your accent before you get back to school then, shouldn't you? I'd actually picked up an American accent in 5 weeks.
There you go. Thank you. And for those that are listening in Bury today, please give my regards to the Bear and the Rugged staff. What a pub that is, right by the Gig Lane ground, a home of Bury FC.
Oh, sad to see it gone. I did watch them a few times in my teens.
Great team. Well, especially when we won up there. Moving on.
Moving on.
So just remains for me to say, drum roll, please. Thomas Schwarz, who is your Christian hero, please?
It's often said that you should never meet your heroes, as they will disappoint you. Nevertheless, I'm going to go for Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
Oh, what a great answer. Because?
Even though my father was born and brought up in Berlin during World War II, And even though he would have known of the Bonhoeffer family at the time, he was someone I didn't take any account of in the first half of my Christian life. Faith was all very individual. I had very little sense of being part of the history of the church. All that has changed very recently with the rise of white supremacism cloaked in a respectable veneer of nationalist Christianity. Bonhoeffer was someone who was willing to listen to his conscience and not think at first of his own safety. Was he right in being part of the plot to get rid of Hitler? I don't know. Oh, by the way, I haven't seen the film which came out recently, but I'm aware it's not a documentary history, so I'm not sure I'd watch it. So I'm going to leave you with no heroes are perfect, but this time I'm going to say Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
See, I never knew how to say his name. I've always said Bonhoeffer. That shows you what I know about speaking German, but it's Bonhoeffer, is it?
It's Bonhoeffer, yes. There's an OE, which usually is an O umlaut, but if you can't find the umlaut on your phone, you can write OE.
And an umlaut being?
Is the two dots over the letter. That's an umlaut. That's in Motorhead.
Yes.
They put umlauts, but we don't pronounce it Motorhead,
Yes.
but I would.
What else do we know about Dietrich then?
Not enough. I know my mum gave me his book, Life Together. Another guy as well who I nearly put on the thing, and I realised I haven't read their whole books. I've just read individual quotes. I think it's maybe because I have a little bit of ADHD and I can't sit down to read a whole book. He was what was called part of the confessing church. So the church that realised that Nazism was an evil ideology and needed to be opposed. So he would have had to wrestle with his conscience, with what would his other family members have thought. I don't even know how well my father knew them. I remember there was a film series called The World at War.
Yes.
I was brought up without TV, so because my parents were sort of a bit academic, they didn't have TV till later. And we were at a friend's house and they were showing The World at War. And my father said, "Oh, that's Maria," which was Bonhoeffer's aunt.
Yeah.
And at the time, I was 14 at the time, I thought, do you actually know her? At least you know of her. You know, he just straight away knew who she was. When you say that, I don't know enough. But as again, all heroes are going to be flawed, and all heroes are going to be looked at in the light of history. So we don't know.
I'm fascinated by all things Second World War. I've got The World at War on DVD. It's fascinating. Episode 1 actually shows Dietrich's auntie there. How did your dad know her?
Well, that's one of the great mysteries I don't know. Now, the trouble is, my mum is now in early stages of memory loss. We won't use the D word or the A word. She either can't remember or is unreliable. For example, she was convinced my dad was interpreter at the Nuremberg war trials. Now, I think he was involved in interpreting for German prisoners of war because he spoke perfect English and perfect German. But I don't think he went as far as going to Nuremberg. But I don't know. It's just one of these frustrating things that we've never had those conversations, and now he's passed on, so we will probably never know.
Because people in the Second World War who were brought up in Germany but were obviously British by the end of it, they were used to great effect, weren't they, at places like Nuremberg. So there's every reason that your dad was involved in that.
There's no reason why he couldn't have been, but at the same time, I realise how great a job he did keeping it together despite the trauma that he must have experienced.
Wow, Tom, that has just absolutely flown by. Thank you so much for your honesty, for sharing what you did. And we look forward to hearing back from you in a couple of years' time, actually, as to what's happened since you had to take a few fingers out of the few pies to concentrate on what God wants you to do. Tom Schwarz, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been brilliant. God bless.
Thank you.
And if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button. It really means a lot. Thank you. Next time on Off-Grid Christianity.
That image is still there.
Yeah.
There was one band, I had to buy their T-shirt for a friend, and it was the atheist, God-hating, church-hating, non-believing something and something. And they were the nicest guys ever. And I actually got chatting to them because someone told them I was a minister. And they don't have a problem with God at all. They're really angry at the church. They came from Sweden, I think, and they'd been excluded because we weren't allowed to play drums in the church. I wish I could remember the thing on the back of their T-shirt. Probably not a good idea to have worn that T-shirt to a Christian conference a bit later on. I didn't go down that one. But my thing is letting people express their heart and realising actually people are not angry at God. People are desperate for faith and purpose and belief, but we have done a lot of damage as a church.
Absolutely.
And we need to step into that space boldly and say, don't blame God for us. We haven't always got it right. Actually, most of the time we get it wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah. And my kids used to say, oh, church is boring. I'm like, church is boring, but God's not boring.
So please join me and author, United Reformed minister, and someone who's passionate about social justice, and that is the Reverend Angie Barker. Until then, cheerio.